Baptist Theological Seminary in Old Testament Studies, and then went on to Brandeis University to work in ancient history and linguistics, where he received his PhD. Interestingly enough, that is a Jewish university located in Massachusetts. He spent a year at the Hebrew University in Jerusalem as a Rotary Foundation Fellow. And as you know, has gone back and forth to that part of the world. He was Assistant Associate Professor of History at West Georgia College and taught courses in the history of ancient and modern Middle East. Was assistant to the president at Mercer University, and then president and professor of history at Bruton Parker College. He's married to Elizabeth Nasser Holmes, who is a Palestinian Arab Christian from Jerusalem. They've been married for 51 years and have lived there for a while and been back and forth. He's gone approximately 45 times and published numerous papers and given a lot of speeches on the Israeli-Palestinian problem, the modern Middle East, and Palestinians. And then our second presenter is Dr. Nima Nouri, who is professor of sociology at the University of West Georgia, where he's been for about 10 years. His scholarly interests include the state formation in Uzbekistan, and he just spent some time there this summer, higher education reform in Central Asia and the Middle East. He earned his master's in Middle Eastern Studies at the University of Texas, and after 2 years of language study in Uzbekistan and Kyrgyzstan, he started a PhD program in sociology at Columbia University. And then after he finished his dissertation, he taught in the Middle East for 3 years at the American University of Sharjah, which was one of the first American-style universities to open in the Persian Gulf region. So Dr. Holmes is going to give us a little overview of the history of the three religious traditions and their connections, and then Dr. Nouri is going to talk specifically about Islam in America today. So, and then we'll have time for some questions. So use those 3x5 cards to write questions, and then we'll finish up with those. All right? So Dr. Holmes, you want to come on up? I think we'll come on up, Dr. Nouri, too. Y'all want to use the podium, or do you want to sit in the chairs? It's up to y'all. You want to use that podium?
Good to see this fine group here this evening. I have been given an impossible task by Steve Davis, and I'm not going to follow what he told me. He told, because he didn't tell me the truth. He told me, he said, I want you to cover 2,000 years of history in 10 minutes. It's impossible. But he didn't tell the truth. It's 3,700 years of history. So I'm going to take an extra minute. Because of that, I want you to know. I appreciate Karen giving my background on things. It's an interesting background, and it gives to me some real feelings about a lot of different things. One, I went to 2 Baptist schools. I'm actually an ordained Baptist minister. I've been in Baptist churches all my life, in seminaries, all kinds of things. One of the things that I discovered in the midst of all of this, some of the very best people that I know are Christians, but also some of the very worst people I know are Christians. That's important. Secondly, I attended 2 Jewish universities, received 2 degrees from one of them, and had a wonderful experience, including finding a wife, at the other one. And these were Jewish universities, and one of the things that I found out being in those places, and I was there for about 4 years between the 2 universities, was some of the very best people that I know are Jewish. But some of the very worst people I know are Jewish. I have been in a lot of predominantly Muslim countries. I have spent a lot of time trying to learn about Islam. And one of my very, very dearest friends that I am unbelievably close to is a Muslim. Now, I have discovered that some of the very finest people in the world are Muslim. But some of the very worst people in the world are Muslim too. In fact, that is true of all societies, every religion, everywhere. And the worst mistake that people make today is judging a religion or a culture based on a small number of people rather than looking at the vast majority who are simply trying to survive, look after their families, and have a good life. Having said that, I think I went over my minute of that, so I'll try to give something in relationship to the history. The history of Judaism is a very long one. It's not always a clear history at all, but it's a very long history. If you want to start with Abraham, as many people do, as he came out of Ur of the Chaldees in what is now Iraq, and moved to Haran, which is now in Syria, and then coming into the West Bank, which is around Shechem. He was a nomad. He was a wanderer. But he began to have things and ideas in relationship to a certain God and to his feelings about it. Now, it was not clear. It was virtually nothing was written. Probably nothing was written about it at that time. It was only later, with the coming of Moses, that you began to have some real things written down where people could have something to talk about. And particularly the thing I think that stands out about Moses was receiving the 10 Commandments. But some people think that's all the commandments there are in the Bible. Do you know how many commandments are there? 613. How many of the 613 do you abide by? How many of them do you even know? A good Jewish person, a devout Jewish person, will know every one and will try to do every one. We as Christians fall far short in our ignorance of Judaism, in our ignorance of the Old Testament, and our failure to follow it. So you really have the beginning of the Judaism itself with the coming of Moses, and then some things being slowly written down. But Judaism went back and forth between paganism and one God during most of the time of the kingdoms. Even David had a pagan statue in his house, according to the Bible. In the temple in Jerusalem that Solomon built, there were frequently pagan statues that had to be removed, particularly during the reigns of Hezekiah and Josiah. The clear picture of a monotheistic religion really began to come about at the very end of the southern kingdom about 600 BC, and became much clearer during what is called the intertestamental period, the period in between the Old and the New Testament. Then it became much clearer. The books were more clearly written. Everything became much clearer about these religions, and that Judaism was indeed a monotheistic religion. And of course, that has continued since that time. Now, just one interesting thing related to it. Many of you know how many Jews there are in the world? 14 million. Now, these numbers are important when you talk about how many Christians and how many Muslims there are. 14 million Jews. 6.8 million of them live in Israel. 5.7 million of them live in the U.S. There are very few in the rest of the world, which is interesting. Now, moving from the beginnings of Judaism to the beginnings of Christianity. Christianity came directly out of Judaism. In fact, in the very earliest periods of time, Christianity was a sect of Judaism. All of the followers were Jews. It was only when Gentiles, non-Jews, began to come into the church, particularly from the ministry of the Apostle Paul, that you have the church changing. Up until then, the church worshiped on the Sabbath. The only book that they had to read was the Old Testament, and it was basically a Jewish sect. It was part of Judaism. With the coming of the Gentiles and with Apostle Paul, this changed dramatically, and the Gentiles began to look at things that made them different from the Jews, and they wanted to set up Christianity where it was not just a Jewish religion, but it was something different. It was the Christian religion. This is when Christianity changed the day it worshiped on. The Sabbath day is not Sunday. It's not today. You can call it the Sabbath day all you want, but that's not what it is. The Sabbath day is the seventh day. We worship on the first day of the week. We do not worship the same day as the Jews. They worship on Saturday, the seventh day. The separation continued even more. The church had all kinds of problems with this, and there was a great deal of controversy and trouble within the church in Jerusalem up until most of the Jewish Christians were killed when the Romans attacked the city of Jerusalem in 70 A.D. and killed off most of the Jews that were there. Then Christianity became a almost predominant, very few Jews were in it. It became a Gentile religion and has since moved more and more towards that. This is basically the early history of Christianity. The history of Islam is quite different. It takes place about 500 years after the beginning of Christianity. It was started by Muhammad. And one of the things that many people do not realize is that Muhammad was a man of multiple talents and multiple abilities, and that he made multiple changes in the society of his time. He was a religious leader, but he was also a leader of society. He was dealing with military and government, and he was the leader of social change. And many times people do not understand that Muhammad, as he directed the people, he changed them from horrible traditions of how they treated women and children and one another. He made it much better. Many times people say, and justifiable, so not enough at times, but he made major changes to make the situation much better. He united the Arabs, who had never been united before, and he moved them into a religion which was monotheistic and away from a very polytheistic religion. The contributions he made were phenomenal. You don't have to like him, but the man made some tremendous contributions, and the religion that he left behind has made a major moves forward. Just to give you an example, it wasn't many years ago, I started to say when I was a child, that was many years ago, I have to say, that you have Islam being several hundred thousand, or excuse me, several hundred million adherents. The number of Muslims now is 1.8 billion. Christianity is 2.4 billion. Islam is the fastest growing religion in the world. It is the dominant religion in many of the countries in the world. It's a religion we need to understand and to try to appreciate, because there are many things in it that are appreciated. It's a monotheistic religion, as is Christianity, as is Judaism. We come from the same traditions. Muhammad, at one time, even had his people praying towards Jerusalem, because Jerusalem was the holy city. Later, he changed it to Mecca. But so much of the Quran comes out of the Old and New Testament. There's so many things they're based on. We need to look as people, not at how different we are from Judaism and Islam as Christians, but how many things we share in common. Doesn't mean we have to be believers in them, but we should realize there are not nearly as many differences as we think, and that if we really make some effort, we can get along with those people quite well. And after all, some of the best people in the world are Muslims and Jews and Christians. Now, indeed, some of the worst ones are too. Let's find the good ones, those best people, and let's work with them.
Okay, this is a very tough act to follow. First, we have the three remarkable religious leaders who are wise, intelligent, and incredibly funny, and I have Dr. Holmes, who also has all the three characteristics. It's a tough act to follow. So what I would start, I thought I would start today by echoing one of the themes that came out of the talk that you heard in the video. And I think it was the Muslim leader who remarked, it was a rabbi who remarked about, he was asked, what's one of the most common assumptions people make, mistaken assumptions people make about Judaism? And he argued that it's that people think of Judaism as a very monolithic faith, lacking in diversity. And I think that really goes to the heart of one of the biggest misconceptions people have about Islam in the U.S. and about Muslims in American society. My father immigrated to the U.S. from Iran in the 1950s. He was so proud that he was, a member of hundreds of thousands of immigrants who sailed on the Queen Elizabeth from London to New York City. At this point, in the 50s, Ellis Island was closed, so I don't know where he embarked, but so he wasn't an Ellis Island immigrant at that point. In the 1950s, most Iranians lived in Salt Lake City, Utah. I mean, to me, when I say that, it just sounds so strange. But of course, when most immigrants come to the U.S., they find a community that they find an ethnic enclave, right? Their ethnic enclave. And so the Iranian ethnic enclave at the time, for whatever reason, I don't know why, was situated in Salt Lake City, Utah. He landed in New York City with very little money. And so the first thing he had to do was find a way to sustain himself. So he found the nearest gas station and he saw someone wiping car windows. And so he just picks up a squeegee and starts, sorry, it's not, no, it's not working. Yeah, sorry. So he, sorry about that. So he picks up a squeegee and starts wiping the car windows. And the owner of the gas station came running out and said, "Hey buddy, what do you think you're doing?" And my dad said, "Well, I'm just trying to make some money here, and I thought this might be a way to do that." And he said, "Look, let me show you how to do this properly." So the owner of the gas station, or the manager of the gas station, hired my dad on the spot. And my dad, for a couple of weeks, washed car windows. Earned enough money to pay for a Greyhound bus from New York City all the way to Salt Lake City, where his best friend was. Got the tickets for the Greyhound, hopped on the Greyhound, and realized that he didn't have any money for food. halfway on this long journey, he almost passed out, and a very, very kind passenger on the Greyhound noticed what was happening. He said, "What's wrong?" And in his broken English, he said, "I just haven't eaten." And so she gave him, I don't know how much money at the time, but just enough for him to buy a meal when the Greyhound bus had stopped. He was so touched by that experience. Gets to Salt Lake City and meets with his friends, this ethnic enclave I was telling you about, in the middle of Mormon Utah. It's not where you would expect to find an Iranian community. He registers at BYU University, and of course then the next thing is, how do I sustain myself here in Utah? So he thought that he needed to go to whoever the head man was at the university. So he walks right up to the house where the president lived, knocked on the door at 6 o'clock in the morning, and the president's son comes out, and my dad said, "I need a job." And to this day, I just find this story so remarkable. The son said, "Let me call my dad," the president of BYU. The president of BYU comes out, and he said, what's wrong? And my dad said, I need a job. Can you help me? And the president asks his German gardener to come, and he says, "Hans, what's your name, sir?" He said, "Hossein. Get Hossein a job." So Hans, begins to work with my dad as a gardener on the campus of BYU. It didn't last very long because my dad didn't know anything about gardening. So one morning, Hans came out and my dad was picking up all the tulip bulbs. And Hans said, "What are you doing?" He said, "I'm weeding." Anyway, so I tell you this story, just a typical immigrant story. My dad in the 1950s from Iran, landing at BYU in Utah. He earns his political science degree from Brigham Young University, and he met my mom in Colorado, at the University of Northern Colorado, Greeley, Colorado. And that's how his sort of immigrant story got started. As the Muslim religious leader pointed out, there are right now 3.45 million Muslims in the US. That constitutes 1.1% of our total population, so it's very small. But interestingly, that population is so diverse. At the moment, no region in the world accounts for more than 20% of the foreign-born Muslims in the US. So right now, of all the Muslims in the US, 20% are from South Asia, 9% from Pakistan, 4% from India, 4% from Afghanistan, 4% from Bangladesh. Middle Easterners only account for 14% of the foreign-born Muslim population. Iraq at 3%, Kuwait at 2%, Syria at 2%, Egypt at 2%, and Iran at 6%. So that just gives you a sense of how not monolithic the Muslim population of this country is and how incredibly diverse it is. And within those percentages, I think you're going to find a lot of diversity within. So of the Iranian population in the US, you're going to find Iranian Kurds, Iranian Turks, Iranian Arabs. You're going to find Baha'is among that population, Zoroastrian, and of course Christians and Jews. The epicenter of Iranian society in the US is Los Angeles, and Iranians refer to Los Angeles today as Tehrangeles. I don't know if any of you have watched there's this reality show. I have to admit I've only watched 2 episodes. It's called The Shahs of Sunset. It's a horrible show. It's not a great show for sort of portraying Iranians, but it's what it does is it in a kind of very extravagant way presents all the stereotypes that Iranians have for each other in the Los Angeles community. So by 2040, Muslims will replace Jews as the nation's second largest religious group after Christians. That's just 2040. By 2050, the US Muslim population is projected to reach 8.1 million, or just 2% of the US population, just 2%. So it's going to, for the foreseeable future, constitute a very, very small minority of this country's population. And I'm going to tell you one more story that I hope captures the cultural and ethnic diversity of this community. before, I'm of Iranian descent. I went to school in Iran until the 3rd grade. I was 9 years old when we left. We left right before the revolution. We returned after the revolution to a country that we no longer recognized. It was a country that was becoming much less welcoming and tolerant of diversity. And for my dad, the point of no return was when the university that he was working at, in which my mom taught as well, this was the University of Esfahan. Esfahan is the 2nd largest city in Iran. The student leaders, students had essentially at this point after the revolution taken command of the universities across the country. And the universities, the students at the University of Esfahan had asked my dad why his wife doesn't wear a head covering. And it was at that moment that we decided that we have to leave. And for my mom, it wasn't that she wouldn't consider wearing a head covering. The problem was she didn't want someone to tell her. And for my father, this was just also anathema. I mean, he didn't like the idea of someone telling his family how they should dress in public. So we left Iran right after the revolution, shortly thereafter, just before the war with Iraq started. So this was late 1979, excuse me. So I'm fast forwarding now to 2004. I hadn't been back to Iran since 1979. I hadn't seen my cousins, my uncles, my aunts. In the early 2000s, there was a beginning of a political thaw. It really looked like the relationship between the US and Iran was beginning to improve. Lots of Iranians who had sort of left Iran and been in the US for many years had decided to return. And so I thought this is a perfect opportunity for me to go back and see my family. So, according to Iranian law, if your father's Iranian, then they recognize you as an Iranian citizen. So I couldn't travel with my American passport. So I called the Iranian embassy and I said, so how do I go about doing this? And they said, well, you have to apply to get an Iranian passport. I said, okay, what are the steps I need to follow? And they laid them out for me. And then the challenge came for my wife. What do I do about this situation? And the embassy says, well, you're going to have to get a passport for your wife. So, went through this bureaucratic hurdle, did the necessary paperwork. I got a passport, and then I began filing the paperwork for my wife. So, in order for my wife to get a passport, I would have to get an Islamic marriage certificate, which meant that my wife would have to convert to Islam. So I discussed this with her. I said, how do you feel about this? I said, this is just a bureaucratic operation. This is not, a kind of heartfelt, soulful thing. This is just something that we need to do in order to go. And she said, fine, we'll do this together. So I open up the phone book. We're living in New York City at the time. And I start calling the community mosques around me. I called the Pakistani mosque, Indian mosque. That's the way, as you can imagine, when the Irish and the Italians came to New York City, they established churches of their own. It's the same for Muslims when they come to New York City. All these various ethnic enclaves, they find religious centers to call their own community centers with religious affiliation. So I went around calling them to find out which one would offer the most hassle-free way of obtaining a marriage certificate. Most of the mosques required 3-4 months of religious training. It just seemed like this incredibly arduous process. I was on the verge of giving up when I found out that in Queens, New York City, there was an Iranian mosque. So I called them up. And they said, sure, come on down, we'll help you out. So I show up one day, and I needed 3 witnesses. So I had an Indian friend, a Turkish friend, and a Moroccan friend. We get on the subway, we head out to Queens, we show up, we're early. And the mullah, the religious leader for this Iranian mosque, turns out to be from Afghanistan, and he's in Long Island and he's stuck in traffic. So, meanwhile, they gave me some paperwork, and they said to my wife, okay, you're going to have to recite the following lines, which essentially just, there's no God but Allah, Muhammad is his prophet 3 times, and that's enough to, in this very kind of bureaucratic way, establish that you're a Muslim convert. So we went over that a couple times. Finally, the mullah shows up. And I was totally unprepared for this. The mullah shows up in a very kind of elaborate, well-groomed, I don't know, kind of hard to describe. He was wearing a turban and a robe, put it that way. So very kind-hearted, jovial man. He's very patiently goes over the process with us. And it takes like 10 minutes. And at the end of this very, very small ceremony, he turns to me and he said, so, Mr. Dorian, have you thought about your dowry? So in the Islamic tradition, in some society, you have to provide a dowry to your wife. I said, no, sir, I haven't thought about the dowry. And I said, what do you think would be a respectable dowry to provide? And he said, gold is always good. And I said, well, do you have kind of a recommendation? I have no idea how many ounces. And he said, how about 12 for the 12 imams? Because it's a Shiite mosque. And I said, that's symbolically very beautiful. Okay, 12. And so he wrote all this down, and we signed the contract. My wife signed the contract. Everything went beautifully well. And at the end of this process, my wife says to me, so where's my dowry? To this day, whenever we have a dispute, which happens rather rarely, she calls, that card comes out, where's my gold? So I'll stop there, and I guess just end it with the fact that even within this tremendous diversity that exists in Islamic society in the U.S. today, still less than 2% of our total population, there is tremendous diversity of views, political, economic, social, within all of these communities. So there's nothing monolithic about Iranian Muslims, nothing monolithic about Pakistani Muslims. So I think it's just important to remember that, because I think we see media representations of Muslims in the U.S., that's not something that usually is presented to us, the extent of the diversity. So I think we're going to have some questions now, so I'm going to stay back. But it's real, thank you for hearing me.
I want to know that you make it to Iran. Good. Did anybody write some questions down? Could we get somebody to collect those? Maybe Pastor Steve will do that work for us. While Steve is doing that, thank you so much. I know we've kind of jumped around, but I hope you're getting some connections here. Again, go home and watch the rest of the video. It'll give you some more insights. But I love that we got really kind of autobiography around these experiences, and particularly Dr. Nouri's experience is really interesting. So, and that's really, I think, where we find those connections, is among ourselves. That for me, growing up with friends who were Hindu and Jewish and Muslim and Mormon and all manner of different Christian traditions, was the way that I learned about people and learned about their traditions. And then when I got to school, in college and seminary, I took more formal classes. In fact, my very first seminary class was not Bible, it was not preaching, it was not pastoral care, it was a course in Islam. Because the very first day was the first thing on my schedule, and I took it because I realized I knew almost nothing about one of the three major monotheistic religions, and I was living in a world that was rapidly changing. And by the time I graduated from seminary, we had gone to war with Iraq. So, in the Persian Gulf. So it's, it was already there. So, all right, let me see if I can, yes.
What's the name of that video on YouTube?
I'll have to,
A keyword or anything?
if you type in interfaith conversation.
Is this video?
Yeah, what's the,
It's called Islam, Judaism, Christianity, a conversation.
yeah, and it takes place at St. Michael's and All Angels Episcopal Church. So I think if you also type that in, it's their YouTube channel. So, I think this is a question. I'll let either of the speakers decide. How did the different sects of Islam come into being? And is the conflict as great as the media presents? One of you want to?
We have the second question.
So let me tackle the first question, the second part of the question first. Sorry. Yeah. So I've traveled very, very widely in the Middle East. I've been to Morocco, Yemen, Tunisia, obviously Iran, the United Arab Emirates. And in my experience, when you talk to Muslims about the two major divisions in Islam, in the Islamic community today are between Shiites and Sunnis. It's important to remember that even within Shiism, or within the Shiite community, there are also many divisions. So Iran is what's called a 12er Shiite community. Southern Lebanon, which is where Hezbollah is based, is also 12er Shiite. Southern Iraq is also predominantly 12er Shiite. But in Syria, along the east coast, you have a very, very different Shiite community. They're called Alawites. And so they see themselves as somewhat distinctive. When you listen to the media, oftentimes they'll lump all Shiites together and talk about the Alawite community in Syria, or the Houthi rebels, which also are Shiites. They'll talk about them as all sort of having this kind of Shiite alignment with Iran, and that is fundamentally incorrect. At times they might find themselves aligned with each other because their political interests are closely aligned, but it's not because of a religious community or a sense of religious solidarity. So within Shiism itself, there are many divisions, and that's kind of important to point out. But when it comes to sort of day-to-day experiences, it's almost the same as it is between Protestants and Catholics, between Baptists and Methodists. And I've often talked to people, so what is fundamentally distinctive about, what are the fundamental sort of differences between Catholics and Protestants? And people might be able to provide very kind of general explanation, but rarely is it a very kind of concrete, well-informed analysis. And I think it's the same, my experience with Muslims has been the same, that most Sunnis cannot really say how they differ from Shiites, and most Shiites cannot say how they differ from Sunnis. And throughout most of the last, I would say, 200 years of Middle Eastern history, it's only when people on the ground weaponize those differences, make those differences politically significant, that they have consequences on the ground for people's lives. So getting back to the very, I can't give you a precise date. Dr. Holmes might be able to do this better than me. But when Muhammad passed away, almost immediately there was sort of disagreement about who should lead the Muslim community after his passing. There was some agreement that Ali would, that Ali, was deemed by most Muslims to be, the follower of choice, and Muhammad's one of Muhammad's closest followers, so that he should take over. But then the challenge becomes when Ali dies. You had two of the Prophet's nephews, Hussein and Hassan. And so that's where the kind of major sort of division, thank you very much, the major division appears. Shiites, who thought that succession should pass through those who were directly related to the Prophet, versus Sunnis, who thought that, who thought differently about that perspective. Also, the Shiites thought that the successors after Muhammad were not following Islam in the kind of in the way that it should be followed. And so that early split over who should lead the Muslim community has its origins in that period. Hussein and Hassan were martyred in southern Iraq in a place called Karbala. And so Shiites used that martyrdom as a way to sort of distinguish themselves politically, socially, and culturally. I wanted to quickly point out, by the way, that Iran did not become Shiite until the 17th century. It's a misconception that they've always historically been Shiite. It's not until very late that Iran as a whole becomes Shiite. So, but just to get to the bottom line, on the ground, when you talk to people on a daily basis, they cannot really articulate, for the most part, what the differences are between these two religious communities. But that doesn't mean that today they aren't politicized and militarized in ways that have, deadly consequences for thousands of people, for people. So I'm sorry, I can't, hopefully that gives you some kind of sense of the divisions.
Y'all asked some big questions.
Question, would you speak to the toxicity of fundamentalism in each of these three religions upon which we focus this evening? Fundamentalism and the toxicity that it causes in these three religions. In my experience with dealing with these three religions, anytime, in any other religion, anytime there are religious fanatics, they're bad news, very bad news, because they are seldom totally rational. They are believers that they know absolutely, positively what has to be done, and that they can do whatever they want with God's approval to do it. That scares me. That's scary, and it should scare you. Because we have some Christians that are that way. There are Muslims that are that way. And there are Jews that are that way. In most of the societies where these people exist, they're a fair number, they cause problems. And whenever it is a society in which they are encouraged in some way, then that makes it just much, much worse. And I'm terrified of them. I have seen some on each of these, and they're scary people. So I wish we didn't have to deal with them, but they're here. But don't judge a religion by the fundamentalists, by the extremists in the religion. Because once again, if you want to do that, people can judge Christianity by it too, and it's not nice. But we've got some real losers in that particular arena, let me tell you. I've talked to some scary people, and I know you have, Steve. And it's sad. So that's as much as I really have to say. I'm just scared.
We're about at time. I think, we'll hang out a few minutes in case you've got another question. There were a few questions. There's one I'm not really quite sure what the question is, so if you want to come up and ask it, do. The one thing I would just add to what Dr. Holmes said, it shows I'm a little bit different generation, but the thing that has kind of changed the equation in the last 15 years or so is the internet. And the internet allows the proliferation of ideas, including fundamentalism across various religious traditions, in a way that you didn't have before, and some of the radicalization of young adults. Some of the radicalization that's happened in this country around neo-Nazis. Who would have thought that would start? But across the world is via the internet. And so that's another place. And we all know that the conversations there, even among our friends, sometimes aren't always the most polite or kind. And so that may just be something to think about, particularly as people of faith. So I think we're going to finish with that. And again, we'll stay here for a few minutes if you've got a burning question you want to ask. I'm going to invite Pastor Steve to come up and give us a sending forth. But thank you for being here. I want to encourage you. You came to this because something moved you to come and learn and listen and be part of a community that wants to understand different religious traditions, different cultures even. Keep learning, keep exploring that, keep having conversations. I'll tell you one quick story. So this is years ago, I'm standing in line at the Dollar Tree, and there's this beautiful older woman behind me, and so like I always do, I just turn and strike up a conversation and begin finding out who she is. It was Elizabeth Holmes. And as part of the conversation, I learned that she's originally from Palestine and grew up as a Palestinian Christian. And I said, oh, I'm so fascinated. I got to go to that part of the world in 1989 as part of a student study tour. And one of the things we did was we met this wonderful Episcopal Anglican priest, and I began to talk about him, Naim Atik, and he wrote this wonderful book about Palestinian liberation theology, and it's Elizabeth's uncle. So you want to know how small the world is, from Jerusalem to the Dollar Tree.
He also did our wedding.
Yes, that was the other thing she told me. So that's how I met Elizabeth Holmes and eventually Lynn. So I'm going to let Steve come up and pray us out.
Let's give a round of applause to these three.